Welcome to African American History Lesson 25. In this lesson we will discuss Maroon societies and autonomous black communities. Throughout the African diaspora, many enslaved Africans refused to remain in bondage. They escaped into forests, mountains, and remote territories where they built independent communities known as Maroon societies. These communities stood as enduring symbols of black autonomy, often challenging colonial rule through armed defense and political negotiation. Maroon communities emerged in remote environments that offered natural protection from colonial surveillance. Though some lasted only a few years, others endured for decades. They often included formerly enslaved individuals as well as people who were born free. Within these settlements, African-based languages, belief systems, and cultural practices blended with local influences, creating unique identities and cultivating thriving networks of survival, kinship, and political structure. One of the most historic Maroon communities existed in the Great Dismal Swamp, a vast wetland straddling today's southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. Before European colonization, indigenous people lived around the swamp's edges and waterways. They hunted, fished, gathered plants, and used elevated areas for settlement. The swamp itself, dense and difficult to traverse, functioned as a natural refuge. English colonists began exploring the region in the 17th century, drawn by valuable timber, especially Atlantic white cedar, and possible farmland if the swamp could be drained. In 1728, Virginia planter William Byrd II surveyed the area and famously described it in his writings. His accounts popularized the swamp and helped spur interest in exploiting it economically. Colonists soon attempted to drain portions of the wetland by digging canals and ditches, an immense labor project largely performed by enslaved Africans. From the late 1700s through the Civil War, hundreds and possibly thousands of freedom seekers hid in the swamp. Some formed semi-permanent communities on dry patches known as Mesic Islands. They built shelters, hunted, trapped, grew food, and traded secretly with enslaved people and free blacks on the edges. The swamp's isolation and harsh conditions made it extremely difficult for slave catchers to penetrate, allowing these communities to survive for decades. In North Carolina especially, the swamp's southern edges became routes for escape and concealment. Maroon communities were not limited to the United States but also existed in the Spanish colonies, which included Mexico, Central America, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic and most of South America. In these areas they were known as palenques. One of the largest and most famous Maroon societies was the Quilombo dos Palmares in Brazil. It lasted for nearly 100 years and stood as a beacon of organized black resistance in the Western Hemisphere. Maroon societies were not passive settlements. They were active military and political forces that confronted European empires through organized wars to establish territorial control and sovereignty. In 16th-century Panama, Bayano led a series of sustained wars against Spanish forces, resisting colonization through guerrilla tactics and fortification of Maroon settlements. Bayano was an African-born leader who escaped slavery around 1552 and organized a large Maroon community in the jungles east of Panama City, near the Bayano River, which was later named for him. Bayano united hundreds and possibly thousands of formerly enslaved Africans into a fortified settlement and built a small autonomous community that defended itself militarily, raided Spanish supply routes, freed other enslaved people, and disrupted colonial trade. Spanish authorities considered Bayano one of the most dangerous rebel leaders in the region. In 1557, the Spanish entered into a treaty with Bayano in which he promised to stop attacking Spanish trade routes in exchange for freedom for himself and the rest of his community, as well as the right to establish towns with Spanish oversight. Spain reneged on their promise, however, and imprisoned Bayano in Peru instead. The members of his community were resettled in communities under Spanish supervision, although other Maroon communities continued to exist in Panama and offer resistance to Spanish forces. In 18th-century Jamaica, Queen Nanny emerged as a central political, military, and spiritual leader. She helped found and lead a settlement later called Nanny Town. She also organized defenses, farming systems, and intelligence networks, as well as training fighters in guerrilla warfare. Between roughly 1720 and 1739, Jamaica's Maroons fought the British in what became known as the First Maroon War. Nanny's forces used ambushes, forest camouflage, horn signals, and mountain terrain to frustrate British troops. In 1739 and 1740, the British signed treaties with Maroon groups, recognizing their freedom and granting land in exchange for peace. Although the main treaty was signed with male leaders such as Cudjoe, Nanny is traditionally credited with securing autonomy for the Windward Maroons. Her authority was unusual in a colonial world that rarely acknowledged African women as military leaders, making her especially significant. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow me on social media. See you next time.